Level 1. The Pre-Med. The acceptance rate sits somewhere in the single digits at the schools that actually matter for the career you've decided you want. And you learn this number early enough that it becomes a permanent resident in the back of your mind, a quiet pressure accompanying every exam, every extracurricular hour, every decision about how to spend a Saturday that a normal 18-year-old would spend doing literally anything else. You choose organic chemistry not because you love it, but because avoiding it signals something to admissions committees that you cannot afford to signal, and the specific brutality of a class designed explicitly to filter people out of this path becomes your first real education in what the entire next decade is actually going to feel like. You shadow physicians on weekends, unpaid, grateful for the privilege of watching someone else's actual job, accumulating the specific currency of clinical hours that means nothing to your bank account and everything to the application you're building one unpaid Saturday at a time. You volunteer at a hospital doing tasks that could be automated, transporting paperwork, refilling supply carts, because the point was never the task itself. The point was proving a specific, sustained commitment that a single essay could never adequately convey on its own. The MCAT arrives as the actual bottleneck everyone warned you about, and that you still weren't fully prepared for. Months of study compressed into a single exam day that will determine, more than almost anything else you've done, which doors remain open to you afterward. You take a practice exam that goes badly, genuinely badly, and the specific humiliation of watching a projected score fall short of what several schools require teaches you something about the gap between studying hard and studying correctly that no amount of raw effort alone was fixing. You retake it. The second score is better, meaningfully better, earned through a specific overhaul of how you study rather than simply more hours of the same ineffective method. The applications go out into a system that will reject you from most schools regardless of how strong your application actually is. Because the math of this profession's bottleneck means rejection is the statistically normal outcome even for genuinely qualified candidates. You wait months for responses that arrive unevenly, some rejections, some silence, and finally, one acceptance that changes the entire trajectory of the waiting. Level 2. The Med Student. The white coat ceremony happens before you've done anything to actually earn a white coat. A ceremonial gesture that the faculty explained correctly is meant to represent a promise rather than an accomplishment. And you understand, even as you're being applauded, that the actual accomplishment is still entirely ahead of you. The debt begins accumulating immediately. Tuition numbers large enough that thinking about the total figure honestly becomes something you consciously avoid, deferring the reckoning to a future version of yourself who will presumably be equipped to handle it. The first 2 years bury you in material at a pace that makes undergraduate coursework look almost leisurely by comparison. Anatomy and biochemistry and pharmacology compressed into a curriculum designed less to be mastered than to be survived, and you develop study systems out of pure necessity that no advisor fully prepared you for. You take your first board exam, a specific gatekeeping test that determines which residency programs will even consider you, and the specific terror of that exam, weeks of preparation collapsing into a single high-stakes morning, teaches you something about pressure that undergraduate exams never approximated. Clinical rotations begin in your third year, and this is where the actual hierarchy of medicine reveals itself to you directly for the first time. Medical students occupying the absolute bottom of a hospital's chain of command, present in rooms where actual decisions get made but rarely consulted, rarely trusted with anything beyond observation and the most closely supervised tasks. An attending physician quizzes you aggressively during rounds, a teaching method that feels, in the moment, closer to interrogation, and the specific humiliation of not knowing an answer in front of a full team teaches you to actually know material rather than merely recognize it. You rotate through specialties you never expected to find interesting and discover, in a few of them, a genuine pull you didn't anticipate, information that will matter enormously when you eventually have to choose a specialty with consequences extending across the rest of your career. The debt figure, when you finally allow yourself to look directly at it, is large enough to genuinely frighten you, and the specific discipline required to keep moving forward despite that number, trusting a future income that still feels entirely theoretical, is its own kind of endurance training that nothing before medical school actually prepared you for. Level 3. The Intern. Residency begins with a specific transition that no amount of clinical rotation experience fully replicates, because you are now the physician making initial decisions, not the student observing someone else make them. And the weight of that shift arrives faster than your confidence does. Your hours are brutal in a way that's widely known, abstractly and viscerally different to actually experience. Shifts stretching well beyond what most professions would tolerate, And the specific exhaustion accumulating across these months teaches you things about your own limits that medical school's difficulty never fully tested. You make your first real clinical decision alone, a call that seems obviously correct in the moment and that you second-guess relentlessly afterward anyway, because the actual weight of a patient's outcome resting even partially on your judgment is entirely different from analyzing a hypothetical case study in a classroom. A senior resident corrects you on rounds, directly, in front of the team, and the specific sting of that correction, delivered without any softening because patient safety doesn't leave room for ego management, teaches you to actually internalize feedback rather than simply survive it emotionally. There's a night shift where a patient's condition deteriorates rapidly, and the training that's been accumulating in you activates faster than conscious thought. A sequence of actions executed correctly under real pressure for the first time, and the specific confirmation that your training actually functions when it matters, teaches you something no simulation or classroom exam ever could. You go home after a 30-hour shift and sleep in a way that barely feels like rest, and the accumulated fatigue across months of this pattern either breaks residents or forges the specific resilience that the rest of this career will continue to demand. Level 4. The resident. Years accumulate, and the specific competence that develops across a full residency is not something any single rotation or exam adequately captures. It emerges instead from thousands of small decisions made under real conditions, each one slightly recalibrating your judgment in ways too gradual to notice in the moment but unmistakable in aggregate by the time you're training the interns who remind you uncomfortably of yourself a few years earlier. You start running codes yourself, the actual emergency response that determines whether a patient survives an acute crisis, and the specific composure required to lead a room through a life-or-death sequence draws on every hour of training compressed into minutes that matter more than almost anything else you've done. There's a diagnosis you nearly miss, a subtle presentation that doesn't match the textbook pattern cleanly, caught only because a nagging instinct pushed you to order one additional test that confirmed something more serious than the obvious explanation. The specific humility of nearly missing something significant, and the discipline of building a habit around that near miss rather than simply feeling relieved it worked out, teaches you something about diagnostic uncertainty that confident textbook cases never fully prepare residents for. You begin supervising medical students directly now, the same overwhelmed uncertainty you once carried visible in their faces. And the patience required to teach thoroughly, rather than simply assert your growing authority, is a discipline in itself. Board certification approaches as the next major gatekeeping exam, a comprehensive test of the specialty knowledge you've spent years accumulating, and passing it feels less like a singular triumph and more like the confirmation of a competence you've actually been building gradually the entire time, one difficult shift at a time. Level 5. The attending. The promotion to attending physician changes your relationship to every decision in a way that surprises you even after years of residency. Because you are now the final clinical authority, the person whose judgment cannot be overridden by anyone else in the room, a weight that lands differently than you expected given how many decisions you already made as a senior resident. Junior residents defer to you now the way you once deferred to attendings, and the specific responsibility of that deference, understanding that your judgment is now the actual backstop protecting patients from resident-level uncertainty, recalibrates how carefully you consider every call. You develop a specific teaching capacity that residency itself never required of you. Translating your own accumulated clinical instinct into language residents can actually absorb, a different skill entirely from simply possessing the instinct yourself. There's a complex case that resists easy diagnosis, symptoms that don't cleanly match any single textbook presentation, and the specific diagnostic judgment required to synthesize an unclear picture into an actual treatment plan correctly, under real-time pressure, draws on the full accumulated weight of every rank you've held before this one. You start carrying the specific, permanent weight of outcomes in a way residency's rotating supervision partially buffered you from. Cases where the correct decision was made and the outcome was still difficult, understanding, at this rank, that medicine's actual practice includes outcomes that skill alone cannot always control. Level 6. The specialist. You narrow deliberately into a specific subspecialty, understanding that the broad competence built across residency has to eventually trade some of its breadth for the kind of depth that produces genuine expertise rather than merely solid general competence. The narrowing feels like a loss at first, the other clinical areas you're consciously walking away from mastering further, but the specific trade every serious specialist eventually makes, depth over breadth, is what eventually produces the reputation that patients and referring physicians specifically seek out. You study complications and edge cases most general physicians never directly encounter. Rare presentations, unusual complications, The specific gap between what general training covers and what genuine subspecialty mastery requires, knowledge earned partly through study and partly through the accumulated pattern recognition of managing hundreds of cases within a narrow domain. There's a case that goes wrong despite your genuine expertise, a complication that even correct management couldn't fully prevent. And the specific professional maturity required to explain exactly what happened to a frightened patient or family, honestly and without deflection, teaches you something about reputation that successful cases alone never could. Referring physicians start sending you their most difficult cases specifically, a reputation earned through years of consistent, careful management rather than any single dramatic save. And this recognition, unprompted and specific, becomes the actual marker of having become something more than simply a competent physician within your field. Level 7. The Chief of Medicine. The final promotion moves you substantially away from direct patient care and into a position shaping an entire department's standards, culture, and institutional direction, responsibility that extends into the training and practice of physicians you'll never personally treat patients alongside. You sit in administrative meetings balancing clinical standards against institutional budget realities that don't always align cleanly with the priorities of physicians actually treating patients at the bedside. And you develop a specific advocacy capacity. Translating clinical necessity into language hospital administration can actually act on. There's an institutional decision, a staffing policy or resource allocation that risks compromising patient care standards you've spent a career building, and the specific weight of pushing back against administrative leadership with the full authority of your position. Knowing the pushback won't always be welcomed teaches you something about the loneliness of this level of responsibility that clinical practice alone never demanded. You shape training standards that will determine what a resident in your department looks like for a generation of physicians who will never know your name, standards built from decades of accumulated clinical judgment now encoded into institutional policy rather than any single act of direct patient care. Somewhere in a library tonight, a pre-med student is staring at an organic chemistry textbook, calculating acceptance rates, absorbing a version of the same filtering process you once survived, not knowing your name, never likely to know it. But shaped nonetheless by training standards and institutional culture, you spent the final years of your career quietly building. The work continues without them knowing you exist, exactly the way it should, because that is the actual relationship this rank has with its own legacy, invisible architecture holding up a structure that will outlast every individual name that ever contributed to building it. So here is the question underneath everything this video just walked you through. Which rank are you standing in right now? Because the Chief of Medicine shaping an entire department's future today did not start there. He started buried in an organic chemistry textbook, calculating acceptance rates, uncertain whether any of it would ever pay off, and he closed that distance one exam, one shift, one earned rank at a time.